Okay, so I'm Martin. I don't know, however many of you don't know me. Who has used Unity in here? I will warn you that this talk is really not aimed at you. I feel free to speak up at any moment and ask me questions, and I would love to tailor the talk for you as much as I can and have time to do in an hour. But generally, this was written as more of a why might you use Unity or not use Unity, and that's really where I'm aiming. So, warning, fair warning, and I don't feel any animosity to you if you leave in the middle. So feel free to get up. Here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to do a brief but really long, actually quite long introduction about who I am and what I do, because I actually think that's slightly more interesting than some of the other stuff in the talk. I did try and eliminate all the disinteresting parts that I talked. I talked for a couple hours on this topic at the Cocoa Heads meetup a month or two ago, and I removed all the boring stuff. So this is just the good part of that talk. And so I mentioned too that it's not really a code talk either. This is more of a high level, why you might use Unity, what's great about Unity, and what kind of blows about Unity. So who am I? My name is Martin Greider. As I said, I'm a freelance contract iOS and game designer developer. I have been working in Unity pretty much exclusively for about the last year. So most of my development efforts have been Unity in the last year or so, with some random iOS specific and C++ stuff thrown in there. I worked at Clockwork for about the first 10 years of my career as a web developer. And then I made my first game in Flash in 2007. And that was completely a side project. It was nights and weekends. You can see it on the left. And now, as of last night at midnight, you can play it out at the arcade. It's built in Unity. So it took me actually about a week to port what was originally 1,600 lines of ActionScript. And then I spent about a month at one point, 2 years ago maybe, porting that to iOS. And then I spent a week porting it to Unity. I started attending IGDA Twin Cities shortly after that first game. I wanted to show it off. I found other people that made games. I know a lot of you know about IGDA Twin Cities, but briefly, IGDA is the International Game Developers Association. I actually do help run this organization now, the local version of it. And it's a pretty big group. It's about 80 of us that get together every month and talk about games. There's always a presenter. There's also always a what we call a member project, which is a shorter presentation at the beginning. And you can come and plug your development thing or your game-related thing at the beginning of the meeting. And then we all go to the bar afterwards. So it's a really great organization. I then started doing iOS in about 2008. And of course, to learn that, I made my first iOS game called Action Chess, which is a kind of a chess Tetris mashup. And then in 2010, I went full-time iOS. There wasn't quite enough work for me where I was to do iOS the full-time. And then finally there was in 2010. And then in 2012, I went freelance and started doing iOS as a consulting thing. And my intent at that point was to do 50% work on my own games and 50% work on contracts. And I was really good about that for about 6 months. And then kind of reality took hold. It's actually way easier to focus on one project at a time. Who knew? So mostly now I do either one or the other, and I try and split it on a bigger, grandiose scale, but it's hard to do. So again, I mentioned I started using Unity seriously last year. I had done it for game jams. I had worked in Unity probably as early as I don't know, 2012 or something. I might have played around with it in a game jam. But I really started using it last year. And like I mentioned, I did actually quite a bit of consulting work in Unity, mostly VR related. So high level, what is it? It's a performant game engine, right? It's a very low level. It's written in C++, and it's optimized for a lot of scenarios and platforms. It works way across a lot of different platforms. Pretty much everything. It's very flexible, and it supports 2D now sort of more than it did before, but you could have done 2D before by just rendering a plane in 3D, and a lot of people did that for a long time because it's very fast. So it's performant. It does what it does very well. very fast, I should say. And it's built on an entity component architecture, which we'll talk a bit about later. It's also a GUI, so it's a Photoshop for game development. So there's an application that you launch referred to as the editor, and in that application you can build most of your game. You do need to write your code outside of the editor. The installer is really small that you download when you download Unity, but then it installs like 13 gigabytes on your computer. So here's the, like, if you check all the checkboxes. So if you say I want to be able to publish to Linux and Samsung TV and Tizen, whatever that is, it'll take up 13 gigs on your computer. Now if you uncheck all that, it's not quite that big, but it is a pretty big thing on your computer. It's also worth noting that it's not super backward compatible. They like to break stuff. So for instance, if you open a scene that you have in Unity 5.5, and then you open it in Unity 5.4, it just doesn't do anything. It's completely empty. It's pretty gross. So you don't want to. So if you open, like, it's pretty good about like opening older scenes in the newer versions, but you can't really go back to the older versions and open newer scenes that have been worked on in the new version. That's just a thing that they don't do. It's a subscription-based revenue model now, and they have a free tier. So it's free to download and play with, and lots of people can publish games on the free tier. But it's also fairly cheap if you are a developer and you're making money at all. I think there's a $35 a month level that you can pay for, and basically like gets you kind of all the stuff. And then there's a $125 per month pro level. And really, it's the same stuff as the $35 a month level, but I think like your revenue, like if you're making over $200,000 a year, you're supposed to be on the pro level. So then they're like, okay, yeah, you should give us some of that money. You can publish to a bunch of platforms, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. I guess I made a note that Nintendo developer accounts include a Unity license, supposedly. I haven't actually verified that. There are a bunch of like services that Unity provides also. So Unity is this bigger company now, and they provide a bunch of different services. Cloud build, so like you can say, I have this game, I'm making it for iOS and Android, and you can set up cloud build, and it will do your builds in the cloud. I guess that's pretty straightforward. So basically, every time you push your code to like a source repository, it will start a build, and it'll send you an email when it's done. And this is super awesome for Android builds. You can just like click the link from your Android device and install it. It is much more difficult for iOS, and you have to set up provisioning and do all kinds of hurdles. But once you do get it set up, I've heard that it's great. I haven't personally gone through all the rigmarole. I've gone far enough to know, it's a pain in the butt. It has an analytics thing that's kind of built in. If you are a developer who's worked in analytics, other analytics packages, it's nothing close to those. Probably, it's really pretty bare bones. But one thing you do get kind of for free is, without really doing any setup at all, you'll get kind of some notifications of some basic events in the system. And so like you can really just not do any coding at all and turn on analytics, and you do get something, and that's kind of cool. There are a bunch of other web services that they have to provide: an ad network, a video recording service. I'm not exactly sure about any of these because I really haven't used them. I did look into the in-app purchase stuff, which is kind of cool. It's very cross-platform. So you basically code to your one in-app purchase framework that's Unity-based, and then you could potentially have people purchasing from Google Play, from iOS, in-app purchases, even Windows and Mac app stores, just right from your app, and you're just coding the same. Presumably there's a bunch of setup for that. I don't know. Collaborate is essentially Git, and it is, I guess, Git underneath, but it doesn't give you access to like the command line. You can't do any diffs. It seems like I don't know why you would use it. Unity is not really an IDE, so you do your coding outside of Unity. It comes shipped with monodevelop, which is kind of interesting. All of your code, not all of your code, potentially all of your code, is going to be in C# in Unity, and MonoDevelop is a project that brings C# to like a bunch of different platforms. So the Mac version, anyway, comes shipped with MonoDevelop. And it's all right. It's not great, but a lot of people use it as the path of least resistance. It automatically opens files into MonoDevelop from Unity. I guess I'll say that a lot of people want to use Microsoft Code instead. And I even know people who will run Windows on their Mac just to get Visual Studio, which is crazy town to me, but I guess people really like Visual Studio with it. On Windows, there's really no other, like, most people use Visual Studio. I'll occasionally drop into Vim, because, you know, that, yeah. Say that again?
Visual Studio is in beta now on the Mac.
On the Mac, yes.
On the Xamarin and stuff.
Yep.
So Visual Studio may be native. It's basically just MonoDevelop standard as Visual Studio.
Right. So I did try it out, and it had the same problem that Code had, which is, and I just can't get past the fact that the tab switching keyboard commands are not the native OS X keyboard commands to tab switch. I mean, like, of all the things, like, they couldn't just get that one thing right. It's also not a 3D modeling program. So you might think, like, oh, it's making these 3D games. All I need is Unity. But no, actually, like, you need something to make your content. And so, like, and it's not Photoshop either. So, like, if you're even 2D assets, like, you're going to have to do outside of Unity. Then you bring them into Unity to turn them into a game. And so, like, you can, you know, it works with a ton of different file formats. And actually, one of the things it does is it imports those file formats into sort of its own kind of native format. I don't know if it's not another format, but when you put them into your project, they will be imported into kind of whatever your platform you're targeting. They're going to do some optimization for that platform. So, which is both good and bad, especially when you're switching platforms a lot. When you've got an app that's like cross-platform and you want to publish to a bunch of different platforms. When you trigger that switch, it's going to re-import all your assets. So if you have a really big project, that's going to take a while, which is where the cloud build comes in. So you don't have to switch platforms if you're just like publishing in the cloud. I think that's really the thing that they were trying to solve with a cloud build. Yeah, there's Blender, and then there's also asset store solutions for content creation inside Unity. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. OK, so why wouldn't you want to use Unity? I mean, that sounds great, right? Actually, I don't even know. That was what is Unity. I haven't done why would you want to do Unity yet. Reasons not to use Unity, and these are pretty specific to iOS. So like I said, I was an iOS developer for a number of years. So I kind of came at this from, OK, well, now I want to maybe do some Android development too, but I still want to do iOS. And there are a lot of things that are really hard from Unity for iOS specifically. And so I apologize a little bit. This is kind of geared toward that. But the device debug cycle is really long. And there's actually not really true device debugging. Like you can't, so the cycle is basically that you publish out of Unity, and that gives you an Xcode project. And then you publish that to your device. So when you're debugging, like you can have your debugger attached, but it's Xcode that's attached, and it's like spitting out, stuff, the debug messages, but they're kind of Xcode's debug messages. Now in Unity, you can tell it like, OK, yeah, you can log stuff in your code, and that will show up in the debugger in Xcode as well. But if you reach a breakpoint or something, I mean, it's kind of it's sad, is what it is. And those two publish steps, I mean, could take a long time, potentially. So it can be really frustrating when you've got a long cycle, debug cycle. And then compiled app size, I don't know if you've seen, but like if you go to the App Store and you download the latest games, they're all hovering right around that 200 meg limit, and or the 100 meg limit. And that's because it's really tough to get these things down smaller. I mean, like basically it's about 75 megabytes minimum, your published app size. And it is possible to like, I guess you can cull some stuff in the Xcode project, like once you've already published out the Xcode project. I haven't done much of that yet. Battery consumption is, of course, going to be worse than like a native app. And that's going to be true for any game platform probably, because one of the things that games are doing is like refreshing the screen, however many times a second, like 30 to 60 times a second. And so if they're not really smart about what they refresh, if they're not doing very specific refreshes of just the things that have changed on the screen, that's going to use a lot of battery. And that's generally why games will take up more battery than your native applications. Apple in particular has done a really excellent job of optimizing UIKit to just update the parts of the screen that have changed. Like it's all very built in. You're less likely to have access to cutting-edge iPhone hardware and features. Like that's kind of a no-brainer, right? So Unity has to code those integrations. There's a whole plugin architecture where you can write native plugins, and then they'll be available in Unity. But it's a dicey thing. You certainly can do it, but then you're specific to that platform. So maintaining a project in particular where you've got one of these native plugins that publishes to more than one platform is that's a burden. So that's difficult. Deep breath. Native iOS UI is quite difficult to reproduce. So basically, I just mean like those native UI widgets, like I was talking about, like UIKit in particular. Your scroll views and your pull to refresh kind of a stuff. There's like a bunch of widgets that iOS gives you. Android gives you different widgets. You're not going to get any of those for free. They have some equivalents, but they're generally very different. There is a scroll view, for instance, and you can figure out how it works. It's not terrible. The documentation is also not amazing. It's probably better than a lot of projects, but it's not up to iOS, to Apple's standards. It's not what I was used to. Generally, it doesn't have code examples, and it won't tell you why you want to use some method. Like it'll tell you what the method does, but it won't necessarily tell you, oh, and you'll definitely want to use this in conjunction with this other thing over here. No, there's going to be none of that. So you often have to turn to some other source for good like how-to stuff. Google is fine for that. Like pretty much any coding platform, there's a lot of different ways to do things. So figuring out like, oh, what's the best way can be really difficult. And that's basically what I spent the last year doing. Like I've only gotten to the point now where I think I maybe have some inkling on some of the best practices. And it's worth noting that iOS applications don't run in the simulator. Like you can't publish once you publish from Unity, you open it in Xcode, you can't run it in the simulator. iOS developers in particular, that's what we do. Android developers, I guess, are used to running on the device, but we don't really do that. Okay, but why might you want to use it? What are the good things? So it's cross-platform. I already mentioned this. Here's a long list of platforms that you might want to publish to. The HTML5 JS stuff in particular is a little bit dicey. It's not as good. It doesn't work in all the browsers for sure, but it is pretty good. And especially if you're just putting up like a test, like you've done a beta or a demo or something, that's certainly possible. You can just throw it up on a website. There's some list of considerations, like cross-platform considerations. Like obviously you need to think about your input. Are you using like a touch or a mouse? Like which screen resolutions are you targeting? And how do you handle when screen resolutions change? That's another big question. Again, I guess I mentioned here, I think I said this before, but basically like in my experience, it's very hard to target a lot of different platforms in one project. It's actually much easier to have multiple projects, but then you end up with a situation where, you don't want to duplicate all that code. You don't want to be copy-pasting code. You don't want to copy-pasting scene. Like, how do you manage that? And I think that's, Unity has probably done a better job of it than some other. I mean, there's not really that many other options for cross-platform stuff. There are, but it's still difficult. It's still more work to go to multiple platforms. I guess that's all I'm saying. Obviously, if you're making a game, Unity is a great choice. There are some other choices. Unreal is another good option. I think Unity wins out for me. There are a number of reasons Unreal is better. I feel like its rendering is actually a little more beautiful. It's a little more photorealistic, sort of by default. But you can make Unity do some of that if you spend the effort, if you put some work into it, if you find the right shaders. It can be just as good looking. I feel like there's disadvantages to Unreal as well, and part of it is just a learning curve. Unity is very easy to get into and start using, so that's a big plus for it. There are a bunch of game engines. I don't know why I mentioned this, but there are a bunch of game engines in Lua, and I spent probably like maybe a month or two last year really like evaluating just a bunch of different options for cross-platform game development. And I was really looking hard for a solution that was code only. Like I really didn't want an editor. I didn't want the GUI. And so I guess a lot of these, like Godot and Moai, well, I guess like Godot I think has a GUI as well. I don't even know why I put that on there. But you know, some of the other solutions that I looked into, they were great, but almost universally, it never was as easy as like a single config to change what platform you're publishing to. Okay, 3D stuff. Anytime you want to do 3D modeling, 3D rendering rather in your application, Unity is a great choice for that. Virtual reality, I'll talk a little bit about. I did a bunch of 360 video work, and that Unity is pretty great for as well. And here I'll talk a little bit about some of the projects I did last year. I worked on this Rhapsody VR / Napster VR app, which is basically just a 360 video player. Chuck Olson, who owns Visual, basically flew down to South by Southwest a year ago, not this last one, but the one before, and just set up a 360 video camera on the stage and recorded the whole day. And they basically took one song from each of the performers that day, and they made this app, and I helped code it. I actually came on initially just to be the like iOS guy, right? Like they said, oh, we have this app, it's totally done, and it needs to get published on iOS. Like, can you help with that? I said, sure. And then the app was not done. There was a lot of work left to do. So I ended up working on that for about a month or so. It was a really fun project. Obviously, 360 video is cool. I worked on another app with Visual also called Atik. I don't know if no one in here is from Atik, I don't think, but they're probably around here somewhere. This is basically a jewelry store, I guess, and it's kind of a gallery for this jewelry, and they really wanted to present it in a new, interesting VR kind of way. And so this is, again, like a Google Cardboard experience. And the interesting thing, I think, is that they recorded these pieces of jewelry in stereoscopic 3D. So there's kind of two different 3Ds that are going on here. You're looking around a 3D scene, but then once you select one of these pieces of jewelry, it sort of pops up in front of you, and it's in stereo. So you actually are viewing a 3D version of this thing rotating around in front of you. Even though it's video, it's not like 3D modeled. Like it's just a video of it rotating in 3D. It's kind of a fun project. I worked a little bit, just a very tiny bit, on Rosa, the virtual protester, which is an AR project where you point your phone at the protest where Rosa is. And Rosa is actually like an 80-foot woman who was present at the Women's March in DC. And she actually was holding a sign. I don't know why she's not holding a sign in that picture. So that picture is completely fake. But she's holding a sign, and there are tweets that show up on it. So they retweeted various women's stuff, women's march stuff, and then they would appear on her sign. I also made a fairly large touchscreen game that was installed at the Nebraska State Fair. Obviously not VR, but kind of fun in Unity. And then a hockey game for Highway Credit Union, which is one of the sponsors of the Minnesota Wild. And so they wanted to just spice up their booth. That's their booth there on the left. They kind of set up a whole hockey kind of scene. We strapped the controller right to the hockey stick. So you're basically just putting on this VR headset and you're holding the hockey stick. You don't have to hold a controller or kind of know what you're doing. You're just blocking shots in VR holding a hockey stick. And that had pretty good reception. Another reason you'd want to use Unity is the asset store. So Unity has this store, and you can publish anything to the store. And there's just a lot of stuff in there. In particular, those 3D assets that I talked about, like needing to create outside of Unity. You can buy 3D assets from the asset store. You can also buy editor extensions that extend the functionality of Unity. For instance, to create 3D assets in Unity, there are editor extensions that you can, in particular Pro Builder allows you to do 3D modeling in Unity. I mentioned Cinema Director allows you to do like movie timeline editing. So you could basically create cutscenes in Unity. Actually, don't buy that one because they're building that into Unity 5.6. Playmaker is like a scratch or a visual coding. So then you really don't need code at all once you buy Playmaker. You can basically hook it up, hook all your game functionality into these Playmaker scripting objects. So if you're not a coder, that's a good option. And there are also like complete game examples, including games that you can they encourage you to just publish. Like so, I ran into like there was just a puzzle game that I was slightly intrigued by. Like I'm a big puzzle game fan, and I looked at it, and it was basically said one of the features of this asset, like you would buy this and then run a script, and it would randomize all the colors, so it didn't look like any other puzzle game, but it still has the same game, and it would randomize all the levels. Like basically like this generator that would generate random levels and color scheme for this thing. So it would be just like ready to throw up into the App Store. Like you're just buying a thing that you would then publish and try and sell. And then there's like a ton of scripts as well, like so scripting, code to do X, Y, Z in the App Store, including a bunch of native stuff. We use this easy movie texture for the 360 video player. At the time, there was no real. You had to use a native plugin to play video in Unity at all, and now they have since like built a little bit of that in. And I know that like there's a few other competing ways to play 360 video now as well. This is not the only game in town anymore. There are also a ton of open source packages. I mean, just because there's this community that's grown up around the asset store and building stuff for the asset store, of course there are people who just want to give it away as well. And so there are quite a few open source packages that are really great, including some for VR that I'll talk about in a little bit. And because Unity is so used by so many people, there are a lot of answers already out there. So if you Google some problem that you've got, the chances are someone has answered it. Probably it was in Unity 4. So you're going to have to change how they answered it to meet your latest version of Unity. So basically, I'm saying take that with a grain of salt. I have found that Stack Overflow is a better resource than Unity has an answers site that is basically a Stack Overflow clone. But it's nowhere near as good as just going to Stack Overflow itself and asking. There's not as much in Stack Overflow about Unity and C# as it pertains to Unity as there is about, say, iOS, but it's still a lot higher quality than the quality of the stuff on the Answers site. And then finally, tutorials, of course, there's a million tutorials. A lot of them are in video, which just bugs me to no end. I don't really learn very well from video. I guess that's enough about that. So how to use Unity, I'll just kind of touch on this briefly. I'll go into a little bit. This screenshot is so tiny, and you can't see that at all. Yeah, it's a good thing I didn't include a lot of screenshots. Oh, hey, look, I made it bigger. So yeah, that's probably a good idea. I'm just going to highlight quickly, basically your Photoshop, your standard Photoshop has different panes. So Unity kind of uses the same thing. So this is the project pane, where you might see these are all the files that you have included in your project. And if you go start viewing tutorials, you'll see the first thing they do is set up their project with a bunch of folders. And for me, at least, that was super unhelpful at first. And then after a couple projects, I realized, oh yeah, I guess you really kind of do want to do that. Yeah. So it's just the thing you got to know. There are these different folders that kind of have special meaning in Unity. For instance, if you're loading an image in code, you can only do it if it's in the resources folder. Who knows why? If you have a native plugin, it has to be in the plugins folder. Again, they don't give you that folder. You just have to know that's what you have to name the folder. There are some other special folders as well. But generally, you can move stuff around and do whatever you want in there. It's pretty good about that. But again, like I said, there's a few that are really important. One thing I like to do actually is just create a folder for my whole project, and then just put everything that I put in my project into that folder. Certainly you don't have to do that, but I find that especially if you're getting a bunch of stuff from the asset store, they all create folders, and then suddenly you've got folders everywhere, and it's folder hell. And you didn't name them, right? Like they were all named by different asset store people. This is the project hierarchy itself. So this is the actual like game objects in your scene. So I guess like maybe I should step back. I think I have a slide for this. But essentially, Unity organizes everything in scenes. So a project can have multiple scenes, and then each scene has multiple game objects. So a bunch of different objects that are all kind of have different functionality, and they. Okay, this gets into the component stuff. I can't remember if I have a slide for components. I do, but it's not. Okay, let me go back to this. So the organization of a Unity scene is that there are multiple game objects, and then each game object can have n number of components. So these are the components. This is the inspector pane, and so once you've selected a game object, it's going to show you all the components that are associated with that game object. And each of these components might have properties that can be manipulated. So like here's a Boolean property that I can't even read, something pre-bake collision meshes, and you can turn it on or off right in the inspector. Now that could be turned on or off in code as well. So that's something that can get you tripped up when you first start. It's a little bit confusing. Now one thing that Unity does pretty well is that you can hit that play button at the top, and it changes you from the scene screen to the game screen panel, and you can actually play the game like right in Unity. So that whole thing about like debugging on the device, actually it's not so bad because you can always play your game in Unity. And of course then you get into problems where you can't, like there's a bug on the device but not in Unity, and that's a different story. But so each of the game objects, back to game objects quickly, each of the game objects has a transform. And the transform is its position in 3D space. And that's the only component that all game objects have. And you can use components to just organize your scene as well. So like I tend to have just a few high-level components, and they're game objects, and they're generally empty. They don't have any components on them at all. And then inside of those game objects, I'll have a bunch of stuff related to whatever that thing is. It might be the UI game object, and then I'll have a bunch of UI stuff inside there, or however I want to structure the project. Any questions about this? I know it's a lot, and I guess this isn't really a tutorial, but so let's see. I probably talked about all this, right? Yeah, we don't care about this. Everything's a game object. So yeah, when you're adding, you can add components to game objects, obviously, and you can write components yourself in C# or I think that Unity has a JavaScript-like language as well. Don't use that. Use C#. C# is really easy to use. And it's definitely emerged as kind of the way. Like the JavaScript support used to be pretty good, and it's not really anymore. I mentioned transforms. There are also UI components, and this is kind of new to Unity 5, I think, is that they've got more 2D-based stuff. And basically, like there's a whole tab for creating UI things in Unity. I'm just going to do a little quick jump over here. Oh, look, there's Action Go playing. So Action Go is a 2D game, right? And I built this entire thing with their UI components. So I've got one canvas. Everything that shows up in the game is going to show up in this canvas. And if you can click this Create button, and here's all the components. Here's all the types of game object that you can create. And again, every single one of these that I click on, like I might create an audio one, this is creating a game object, but with some specific audio component, like an audio source component, for instance. But so most of my game is created with items inside this UI component list. And again, these are still creating game objects, but they're created with a special transform, a rect transform. So instead of having 3D spatial positioning, it's just 2D spatial positioning on a plane. And that plane is defined by your canvas. That's probably enough about that. And then I mentioned scripts. Like you can create your own scripts. And then, so for instance, I have a script object. I don't always do this, but this is something I've done in a couple projects. Basically, like you have a bunch of scripts that don't have any specific game object they're associated with. They don't need to. They're sort of higher level than that. And some people will make like a game manager and add these scripts to them. Some people create an individual game object for each one. Again, you can organize it kind of however you feel. But I've got this one script object, and it's just got a bunch of my custom scripts on it, including my game model and I guess another game script. These are poorly named. And a navigation script. So one thing that the navigation script will basically just say, like, when you hit play, go to the game screen. Now, it doesn't change scenes in this particular game. This is a one-scene game. I guess I should mention that, too. Like, you can organize things in multiple scenes in Unity, and that can be helpful, especially if you've got a really big project. But you can do a lot of stuff without doing that, I guess. Yeah, that's enough about that. Oh, I was going to show you. Oh, so these are all custom components that I created by essentially just creating a new script. So a little bit more about scripts. They mostly derive from monobehavior, which is basically what gives it its component functionality. So you can't have a game component that isn't derived from monobehavior. That's the base class for all components. These monobehavior scripts automatically get a start method call when they are first loaded up, and then they also get updates and fixed updates on a regular, like basically that's your loop, that's your game loop. So every X number of frames that the game is going to show, you're going to get one of these update ticks, and that just means the update will get called. So a lot of people just throw all their code in the update, which is okay, and that'll work until you start doing something that's not performant, and then you have to move it out. There's also this awesome guide to monobehavior method execution order. There are a bunch more methods that are not start and update. And knowing what these are is actually a really great idea. So like, there's also a wake. So a wake happens when, yeah, I guess it's before start. I don't know. Yeah, it's worth knowing that all these exist. I remember reading it one time and being like, oh, that's cool. So you can get like on pre-render before the game object is rendered. I'm not going to go into coroutines, but that's also another thing that you will probably want to know about if you are doing any scripting in Unity. It's a way to, yeah, okay, I'm not going to go into it. Yeah, it's not technically multi-threaded. It's kind of like multi-threaded. So, okay, yeah, no. Okay, yeah. So handling input, there's a ton of different ways in Unity to handle input. It's like everything else. There's a million different ways to do it. And there are too many options, really. The Unity Asset Store has a couple of really nice controller solutions. In Control and Rewired. Notably, In Control was open source for a long time, so I've been using the open source version of that for pretty much forever. And what those do is they basically map kind of a generic controller API to all the possible different controllers. So they have tried to basically create really cross-controller solution. So like if I have an Xbox controller, pressing A will typically do the same thing as having a PS4 controller and pressing X, I think. But essentially, like, you can just write to that one API, and then you don't have to think about, like, oh, what if they plug in an Xbox controller? Or what if they're using it? And that's mostly for PC, PC development, PC, Mac, Linux, like desktop development. But both of those assets do also have stuff for touch handling, which maybe you want to use that instead of the built-in touch handling stuff. I don't know. I'm not going to go into all the details about this screen, this slide. Source control. Who is actually a developer? Who's a coder in this room? Yeah, most of you. OK, so I hope you're all using Git. And you should also use it with Unity. Again, I mentioned that collaborate thing. Don't use that. You're using Git with Unity is pretty straightforward. Google for best Unity Git ignore and find the one that's on Stack Overflow that has 1 million votes. Or use the one from, there's a number of sites that have best git ignores for X platform or whatever. They're going to all do kind of the same thing, but mostly they're going to exclude the library directory, which you don't need to back up. There's no reason to back that up. And it's none of it's your files. Most of the stuff that you add to the project is going to be in the assets folder. So almost always it's assets / something. So that project hierarchy that I showed you where you can create new folders and stuff, when you create a folder in there, it's going to go inside the assets directory. That's just where it stores it. Yeah. You could use the SVN if you really wanted. I'm not going to go into this, actually. I think this is a little bit weird. The way images are imported, I think I kind of already mentioned this, actually. OK, I just said I wasn't going to go ahead. So, OK, quickly, how to use Unity for iOS specifically. You build the game, right? And then you change your build platform to iOS. Then you check your player settings, and you put in things like your app identifier, app icon. You can actually set up like your provisioning name, entity name in there if you want. And then once you publish it, again, you get an Xcode project. And you can go in and check those things that they're actually correct. And sometimes they will be, sometimes they won't be. And that's about it. Like, it's really that easy. It does kind of make things pretty crazy easy. Now, there are a bunch of gotchas. Sometimes, like if you're using a native plugin at all, sometimes those will have requirements. So you'll have to go in and change the Xcode project in some way after importing that plugin. And so then whenever you do a new build, right, it's going to spit out a new project. Well, you can tell it to do it on top of the old project, and you can tell it never do that. So that's like you just kind of get to choose. Well, if you have done a bunch of customization in the Xcode project, you're definitely going to want to do it on top of the old one, and hopefully it won't overwrite any of those settings. Now, one thing I've noticed is that if you are, say, developing a native plugin, if you overwrite on top of the old project, it's not going to overwrite those plugin files, which is super. I mean, I guess they had to choose one or the other. But anyway, the point is like you're going to want a new build pretty much every time, which is pretty frustrating. Also, no iOS simulator. So I'll talk a little bit about VR. This is actually more about like high level, like the different types of VR. Who is pretty familiar with VR or has done any VR development? I don't know why I keep asking this. Just to keep you awake, I guess. So there are a couple different, what I think are sort of things that really differentiate VR right now. Essentially, OK, I'm not on that slide. This is Google Daydream on the upper right-hand corner. And it's basically like Google Cardboard, which came first. Cardboard, essentially, you can run on any phone, like any phone with an accelerometer, I think, or maybe a gyroscope. And you basically put it into one of these things on the lower left-hand corner. It used to literally be cardboard. The lower right-hand corner, that's what I consider the Cadillac of Google Cardboard. It's like some custom molded plastic. It's very soft on your face. And one of the cooler things about that is it's got this trigger on the right. So input in Google Cardboard, you've got your phone in the device, right? So how do you input anything? Well, the original Google Cardboard actually had a magnet. So they had a little magnet switch. And they used the compass in the phone to detect when that magnet was moved, which wasn't really super reliable. So they got rid of that pretty quickly. And now they have like a physical kind of like you pull this thing down and it actually like puts a little, it just pushes the screen with a little capacitive pad. And the one on the bottom right here actually has a physical button that pushes out a little knob that has the same capacitive functionality. So it's like it actually pushes the screen, like it taps the screen. And both Daydream and Google Cardboard both use this same plugin, like this Google Developer plugin. It's worth noting, and I mentioned this in the later slide, but Unity 5.5, as of Unity 5.5, VR is kind of built in. Like you can switch your camera type to stereoscopic, and it'll actually publish to a bunch of these different platforms without a plugin at all. But some of the platforms, it is worth having the native plugin, even though it does this, because they give you access to kind of additional functionality. And it sort of really depends on what platform you're targeting. Oculus and Samsung Gear VR are very similar to Cardboard, but they are a little bit more performant because they sort of take over the entire functionality of the phone. They don't run on top of the OS like iOS or Android. They're like, it is its own OS basically at that point. And so that's a little bit more performant. Thanks, John Carmack. They also strap to your head like by default, so you have your hands kind of free to maybe be holding a game controller, or the Gear actually has like a weird little like D-pad on the side of it that you could use potentially, and actually a lot of games use it for input, which is, it's a horrible user experience because you're holding this thing up and then you have to hold your arm up even though you're not holding the thing up with your arm. It's stupid. So some of the limitations of these platforms that I've talked about so far is that both Oculus Gear and Google Cardboard and Google Daydream have this problem where they're not positionally aware, right? They don't know when you lean forward. So there's like this look around the corner problem where you see a corner in VR and you're like, oh, I want to look around the corner. You lean forward, but the corner moves with you. And your head turned, like it knew that you turned your head, but it didn't know that you moved forward. And that can A, make you sick, and B, it's really frustrating. I can't see around the corner. So Cardboard has even more limitations. I mean, Cardboard is really meant to be the lowest common denominator. So like, yeah, it's just bad. I mean, it's not as bad as it could be. Like, it's still VR. It's interesting. But it's definitely prone to making people sick. It's usually low frame rates. It's pretty painful if you're having to target that. But for some experiences, just for like VR, for like 360 video or something like that, it's great. It's fine. OK, so here's like where the plugins are. You can go download them, follow these directions. That's how to do it. So Oculus and HTC Vive are what I consider to be sort of more real VR because they've solved that positionally aware problem, right? Oculus with some cameras that point at your headset, but HTC Vive, more interestingly, with what they call lighthouses. So they put them up in your space, like you put them at sort of the corners of where you would want to walk around. And the headset and the two controllers that it comes with are positionally tracked within that space to like the millimeter precision. And people can like throw the controllers and catch them again. It's that, it's really precise and tells you exactly where you are.
What's that called?
So that's called HTC Vive. It's VIVE, and so Oculus is I think 600 now. They've just discounted it like $200 recently, and the HTC Vive is still 800. And those you have to have like a really fairly powerful PC and to run basically. So they have to be tethered to the PC. They both have cables coming out of the back of the headset or top of the headset. As of 5.5, again, you can build for all of these platforms directly from Unity without any plugins or anything. But both Oculus and Vive have their own plugins that you can use if you want. And now we're starting to see more cross-platform plugins that are like, use this, and then like it'll just work in all of VR. Like, they're just basically collecting the 5 or 6 different plugins that you need and switching at runtime on what you are. There's actually one. The project that I'm thinking of in particular is called T-Butt. I don't really know why it's called T-Butt. There's probably some reason. VRTK is another just kind of random recommendation here. There are sort of issues that need to be solved in VR, common issues like UI paradigms, I guess. Like you need to be able to pick things up. And you need to be able to sort of click the button and have it do something. VRTK basically makes a lot of that easier. It's worth definitely checking out if you're going to do any VR development at all, looking at what it provides. There's like 30+ demo scenes in there, and you can literally just open those demo scenes, hit play, put on the headset, and be like, oh, this scene shows how to make a lightsaber and have it hit objects and stuff. And you'd be surprised at actually how many of those issues are really hard to solve without some examples of like, well, how do I do this? So that's really worth grabbing and playing with. And that's really all I've prepared. So questions? No.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. From like, I don't know what it's called, but I'm just wondering, if you get like a rotation matrix from a gyroscope off of Unity, or is it something more difficult?
So Unity handles that for you. So yeah, you don't have to do any of that. And previously, the individual platform APIs would handle that. So Google Cardboard API did all of that for me when I was doing Cardboard apps.
Okay.
The last time I was doing Cardboard apps,
So you don't
I have
to
noticed.
Around the scene, you're just kind of.
So as the gyroscope in the camera moves, it's reporting its data, and that's doing some crazy math to then report that now you're looking over here or whatever.
Yeah.
And again, Cardboard, it's pretty good, but it really depends on your phone. And they're targeting everything, so it's a lot of the phones it's worse in.
Yeah, I have a color cross. It's not better.
Right. So I noticed I have a Samsung Gear, right? So this targets the this is the high-end Gear thing, but you can also run Cardboard on the Samsung Gear. And so I was developing a Cardboard app, and my iPhone 6 Plus, or actually no, I was using an iPhone 5 to test. This is a really old phone, way before the Samsung Gear, and its rotational awareness is awesome.
Yeah, okay.
But not the Samsung Gear, oddly. So it really it can depend. So I gotta wrap it up, I think. But I'll be hanging out just right outside the door if you want to corral me for more questions. Thanks.
There was a really interesting idea making the rounds on Reddit a couple nights ago, where they were basically talking about the potential for tracking and basically projectile tracking, where a guy had on I think it was a Vive, and another guy whipped a tennis ball at him, and he caught it.
Right.
Because he could see where the line was coming from. And it was
Yeah. So that was that's from a YouTube video that I saw of it's actually R&D that's being done at Disney, and so they've got they've got a camera. And the camera is doing real-time prediction tracking for the physics of the ball that's being shown. And so then the video is actually really worth watching the whole thing, because they basically inside the headset, they're showing the full trajectory of the thing coming, and then they stop showing the full trajectory and they just show the predicted where it's going to reach the person. And so the person in the headset, it just sees a dot, and they put their hand out where the dot is, and then in real time, or in reality, the camera, you see them just put their hand out, and then the ball falls right into it.
That's nuts.
And it's
No way.
yeah, it's really cool. Yeah.
I actually wanted to talk to you about stuff like that. Does Unity have any sort of support for you use that to, instead of using it as hands to grab a ball or do whatever, can you put it in your pocket and have it do every time it notices this movement it walks or something like that? Is there any support in it?
I mean, kind of what you do with the controller data is sort of up to you. So yeah, you can absolutely do that kind of stuff. So I mentioned in the beginning, we actually strapped the controller to the bottom of a hockey stick, and then just use that controller data to position the virtual hockey stick, right? So yeah, you can kind of do whatever with that data.
Ask you a quick question?
Yeah, let's walk.
let's walk.
Let's walk. Yeah.
You had said earlier that you helped the guy make an app where he 3D video or 360 video.
Yeah. Yep.
I'm gonna put that in. Anyone?
Oh wait, I'm sorry. Yeah, I did.
I gotta leave that.
Wait, I gotta leave this behind. Sorry. Oh no, wait, you're not the guy. No.
He's the guy.
Oh, you're the guy now?
Yeah.
Do you want this?
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Cool.
They,
Question on that.
but he was at REI before that in Seattle. Wicked smart dude. Yeah. He's a cool analytics guy. He's totally got a West Coast vibe. We're done at 4:30 and we all go home.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's awesome. I'm like, I couldn't agree with you.
Yeah. Well, especially if they're on location.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's close out. That's close out.
So it's only 15, 17 minutes from door to door.
Yeah.
So it works all right.
All right, have good talk.
How'd yours go?
It was fantastic. She did a great job.
In my PowerPoint, I had to use somebody else's computer. His computer waited.
Oh,
That was an issue, but no, you did
I
great.
was,
No, you
luckily,
were,
I've
you were
done
great.
it a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, I haven't heard you in a long time, so I'm very
Well, you go ahead and fill in all the blanks.
And she had it. She had a really obnoxious heckler too.
Oh, I'm sure she did.
She handled it really well.
Weird. Is that what it is?
So did you guys find any talks interesting? Most of them. I was told that I did too fine of a grain performance. What I was talking about.
What did you present?
Last year doing it wrong.
Oh, okay. I didn't go to
The
that.
computational theory behind it.
Okay. So there are a lot of, when you're